Well, hello everyone. Sorry that I'm late, but here I am. So I've been thinking about some stuff lately, and basically, I'd like to reflect on the first interview that I did in this year's SBL and in San Diego. The first person I interviewed, and I guess we can call it season 2 of History Valley SBL, was Professor Editorial. And I can't wait to put this one out. It's gonna be coming out in a few days, maybe sooner. But in that interview, I was reminded of a crucial fact, because this is one of the key things that was discussed during the interview, and that is, we don't really know the full content of Marcion's gospel. We don't know. And it's reconstructed differently, depending on the scholar. But even though that was already obvious to me, it's just the way, it's like when I heard it that day, for some reason, it just hit me different. It felt different to me. I gave it some thought. A lot of thought. And it led to me just a few days ago to changing my mind. Because how can one claim that this is the first gospel? We can't even be certain about the full content of the gospel. And that troubled me very much. That bothered me. How can one claim that this gospel helps solve the synoptic problem in any capacity when we don't even really know for sure what the full text looks like? And here I am questioning if there's a Q source, because we don't even have external evidence for this Q source. Then we really can't know what it looked like for sure. If it existed, okay, I guess it had the double tradition, either a lot of it or all of it. But even if something like Q existed, we can't be certain of the full text that's in there, because we don't have the text. It's reconstructed based on comparing Matthew and Luke together, and the assumption that Matthew and Luke didn't use each other. Although some will believe in Q while saying that Luke knew Matthew, or even the reverse, Matthew knew Luke. So you do have positions like that where they kind of cross over, but that's a topic for another time. So when I thought about it some more, it seems like the most, to me, at this moment, at this time, because I've changed my mind many times before, the more I think about it. And one thing I do want to make clear, I'm just some guy of an opinion. You know, I'm not on these people's level. I'm just some guy of an opinion. And I'm telling you my opinion. To me, it's easier to believe that this gospel is the abridged Luke. Going with that position, it doesn't matter what the gospel looked like. You don't need to depend on any one reconstruction. You can just say it doesn't matter what it looked like to the end. You can just say it's an abridged Luke, and you're done. The full content of the gospel doesn't really matter, because if it's abridging Luke one way or the other, regardless of which reconstruction you use, then everything's easier. The rest falls into place. Now, that's not the only reason I changed my mind. There's another reason. This one always bothered me. If the gospel existed before Mark, and by the way, similar questions are asked by scholars, and this is in regards to Q. Marcion priority, in my opinion, has the same problem as suggesting Q predating Mark. Now, let me explain what I mean very carefully. Mark has little bits of double tradition. And when you ask scholars about that, they'll refer to it as the Q-Mark overlaps. Okay, but Mark doesn't have much of that material. He just has a little bit. Just a little bit. And obviously, you can't say he has all the material, because why would you? Then you wouldn't need Q. You could just say Matthew and Luke got it from Mark. So that's not going to work. Nearly all the double tradition is missing from Mark, which is the whole point. And it can make one wonder, did that double tradition exist independent of Mark before Mark? Because some will say that there's crossover between Mark and Q because they had common traditions. Okay, maybe. It's still very hypothetical to me. You can't know that. It's speculation. There's not much basis for it. If it's just honestly, we don't have any proof. Some would date Q after Mark, and that would apparently solve the problem, sort of. Although many will date Q before Mark. In the free source hypothesis, some will argue that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all knew Q. Maybe. Again, it's still speculative because Q is a hypothetical document, but we don't know exists. You don't know it. So this is where I think the Farrer hypothesis has an edge against Marcion priority. Because you can just say Luke got it from Matthew. Matthew and Luke both knew Mark. And you don't have to claim that Luke got anything from Marcion's gospel. You don't have to worry about knowing the full content of Marcion's gospel and working with different reconstructions, which are themselves, if we can just at least admit that even those reconstructions are sometimes hypothetical, because what these scholars are doing when reconstructing the gospel is they're working with primarily Tertullian and Epiphanius primarily, but yet they come up with different reconstructions that can heavily differ from one another. Which, in my opinion, I think anyone holding Marcion priority as the truth should obviously be disturbed by those different opinions. How do we get around that? I don't think one can get around that. It's a big problem. So here I am, looking at what these scholars are doing with Marcion's gospel. And I'm trying to form my own opinion based on what they're doing. It seems to me that saying that Marcion's gospel abridged Luke is the best solution. I really come back to the belief that Marcion's Paul is abridging canonical Paul as well. I'm back to believing that again. The one thing that really bothered me is Marcion's Paul. Based on the reconstructions I've looked at, it's got all the Jewish references taken out of the text. And I think that's one of the best cases to make against the idea that this text came before the canonical New Testament. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And but I think that this is the easiest, most parsimonious solution to this problem. Because as I was just explaining in the last several minutes regarding Marcion's gospel, the same issue exists for Marcion's Paul. Same issue there. You can't really know what that text would like either. Sure, you got the same old people to work with, Tertullian and Epiphanius, right? Those are still our primary guys. Same guys that you got to use when reconstructing the gospel. Same guys you got to use to reconstruct the so-called apostolos. No. To me, this is very problematic. And I love the work they're doing. It's great, but I'm personally done believing Marcion priority. I'm done. I'm done believing that. I think Luke used Matthew. Luke both knew Mark. Maybe there was a Q before Mark. I don't know. I feel like I'm agnostic on that. I lean towards Q probably didn't exist at all. Yes, Jesse Pelaz, I agree. I agree now that Marcion does not predate Mark, Q, or Paul. Well, if Q even exists. I think Marcion's New Testament is after every single book in the New Testament. It's totally afterwards. And he's abridging the canonical New Testament. That's where I'm at now. I got some shows coming up in which I'm going to kind of do some redos. I'm also going to be trimming down other videos as well, and editing out some of the things I said in order to get even the older videos to try to reflect my current views as much as I can. But yeah, there's going to be a lot of changes here. A lot of changes. What I will say is this does not really alter my views. Actually, it doesn't really alter my views that much on Paul, the historical Jesus, and James. So most of what I think overall about these people as historical figures is not impacted very much by my decision. My view on Acts has not changed. I'm still very skeptical of Acts. There's a lot of problems there trying to claim that it's coherently talking about the same individual we see in Paul's letters. I don't care if you believe in canonical Paul or Marcion's Paul. I don't care which one you prioritize. It's true either way. So you can have an opinion one way or the other, but it's still true that Acts heavily contradicts the letters. I don't care which version of the letters you use. And one of the other things I had a big issue is, I can't remember which church father was talking about this, but there was a reference to a 2nd century individual named Basilides. Basilides rejects the pastoral epistles, and he came to that conclusion before Marcion's New Testament was even formed. And yet, Some think the pastorals were created after Marcion's New Testament because Marcion didn't have them. I mean, maybe, but maybe it's easier to think that Marcion didn't like the pastoral epistles at all and he just left it out completely when he abridged Paul. He's abridging Paul anyway. So why not think that maybe he chose to leave some letters out? That's what I think's going on. And someday, I do want to get my actual thoughts written down, but it's part of the reason I haven't gotten around to it is I keep changing my mind. Actually, that's the main reason. I'm trying to make up my mind about what I think about all of this properly before I get to actually writing about this, about my opinion. But at this stage, I think Marcion's gospel is abridging Luke. Wave of Mutilation says, I changed my mind about Jesus twice today already. Well, there you go. Changing our minds is all part of the journey. And there are some that don't respect that. I'm not going to elaborate on what I mean, but there are some that don't respect that, which makes me question certain individuals that will berate others for changing their mind. It shows that they're not open-minded themselves. But that's perhaps a story for another time. But yeah, at this juncture, I think Marcion's New Testament is abridging the canonical one. And I think it explains that, from what I can tell, and I think this is true in every reconstruction of Marcion's gospel. I think it is, if I remember correctly. I'm putting the qualifier, if I remember correctly, in case I'm misremembering. I don't care which reconstruction you look at, but if I remember correctly, what they all reflect is the Jewish references are primarily omitted in both the letters of Paul and the gospel, which is very strange. Marcion is extremely anti-Jewish, and that's made very clear in his antithesis. It's made very clear. And I don't think there's any way of getting around that. So one can argue, as many have already before, because it's obvious. It's an obvious point to argue, one would think. Marcion has the theological agenda necessary to explain why the Old Testament references, many of them are gone from Marcion's New Testament, because he did exactly what Tertullian claims he did. He cut it out. He cut these texts down with scissors or a knife. A knife. I think it's a knife, is what Tertullian said. So he cut it down. That, to me, is a very logical explanation. I'm not so familiar with the idea that that Marcion's anti-Hebrew views and conflict with his letters of Paul S. Mill. I think some argue that more with the gospel. I used to buy that. I don't anymore. Because you got to think about it, right? To me, this is how I'm looking at it as an amateur. But here's how I'm looking at it. Marcion's gospel, if he's omitting, it doesn't have to omit every reference, but it's omitting enough. Or I'm thinking Tertullian's got a point. He's got a point. When it comes right down to it, it's still omitting much of the Old Testament references that you see in canonical Luke. That which you do not see in Marcion's gospel, meaning most of the Jewish references are missing from Marcion's Evangelion, gospel, whatever the hell you want to call it. So, someone in the chat says I wouldn't believe anything the church fathers say as a general rule. I don't think one should put a blanket statement like that in generalizing church fathers. I don't think they're that distrust. I don't think we should distrust them that much. I don't think they're that untrustworthy. But it seems to me that they actually are right about this. Because when I rethink these texts, I come to a different opinion. Why are much of the Old Testament references missing from Marcion's New Testament? Well, because Marcion didn't like that, he took it out. One can argue, for instance, the beginning of Marcion's gospel omits the infancy narrative in canonical Luke on purpose in order to establish ambiguity about Jesus' origin. Marcion's gospel doesn't explain where Jesus comes from. In some older reconstructions, it's suggested he descended out of heaven, but in more modern reconstructions, that's omitted. However, what I think is going on is, because you look at Marcion's antithesis, it's clear he doesn't think Jesus had parents and that he did come out of heaven as a full-grown adult. So one way or another, ambiguity is being deliberately created in the beginning of the gospel to allow for Marcion to be right about the origin of Jesus. And I say that's what's going on, personally. When I look at Luke, and I wonder, because I used to say these things, even recently, I used to say these things that one of the big things going for Marcion's gospel is it doesn't have several different versions of the same miracles or duplicate miracles that you encounter in Mark and Matthew. Mark's two blind men, like one in Jericho and another in Bethsaida. So Jesus heals two blind men. In Matthew, it's 4 blind men. In Marcion's gospel, it's 1. Mark and Matthew have 2 feedings, the 4 and 5,000 in Mark and Matthew. Luke and John and Marcion's gospel only have a feeding of the 5,000. Well, maybe another way of explaining it is Luke is the one reducing the amount of repetitive miracles that he encounters when reading Matthew and Mark, as he's using Matthew and Mark. And Marcion's gospel is simply abridging Luke. So that's why Marcion's gospel is also doing that is because it's an abridged Luke anyway. And John is going along with much of the editorial decisions of Luke as Luke is editing and redacting Matthew and Mark. So I think that's all one's going to say about that and move on from that. The wonderful thing about it is it doesn't matter what Marcion's gospel looks like. You don't need to worry about it. Because no matter how it ends, it's abridging Luke. Or no matter how it looks like, it's abridging Luke. So no worries there. Yes, Esmel, I am aware of the idea that the first 2 chapters of Luke were added later. Yeah, I used to think that, but there's no manuscript evidence for it, and that's one of the big problems with it, and I don't believe that anymore either. I think they were always there. They're always there. It seems certain that Marcion's gospel definitely omitted, doesn't have an infancy narrative. Tertullian and Epiphanius agree on that. And every reconstruction of Marcion's gospel, every reconstruction of Marcion's gospel has ever existed, to my knowledge, does not have the infancy narrative for that reason. So there's universal agreement there that Marcion's gospel does not have the infancy narrative, so we don't have to wonder about that. Everyone's united on that point, on that specific point. Max Key says, I would say Marcion is the Q, but corrupted, they forced the second and third witnesses or writings. Well, kind of reminds me of what I was saying, used to say. Well, I wondered if Marcion's gospel was already Q, and that solves the problem. I didn't say it was a corrupted Q. But again, that's hypothetical because, at least what you're saying, because I don't know if there was a Q before Mark. I don't know. So saying that Marcion's gospel, which its reconstruction is at least partially hypothetical, and then saying it's corrupting a completely hypothetical source we don't know exists. You get what I'm saying? It's one hypothetical claim upon another. Let's see here. Yeah, Smil says that would be the positivist conclusion that the infancy was always in Luke due to no contrary evidence. Well, if that's how you look at it, I don't care. That's fine. Call it a positivist conclusion. I care not. The fact is, we have no evidence that Luke didn't have the infancy narrative. Absolutely none. It is pure conjecture. It didn't have it, simply based on an argument of reading the text. That's not proof of anything. It's not. And this is another reason why I changed my mind on Marcion's New Testament. I realized I was being inconsistent with hypothetical reconstructions and hypothetical sources. Another reason I changed my mind is to be consistent with how I view text. I realized I was being inconsistent in my conclusions, so I fixed it. But in order to do that, I had to give up Marcion priority entirely. I had to give the whole thing in order to be consistent with my views. There is I do think Luke had a third source in front of him. I do think Luke knew Josephus. I do think Matthew and Mark also knew Josephus.
and I think John did too. But I think Luke had a third source, and I'll get to explaining which one I think that is. I kind of already said it before. I guess I'll say it here. Why not? I think Luke knew Ebionites. I think he knew Ebionites. And I think he got some of the material on John the Baptist from Ebionites. I think Ebionites knows Mark. I don't have any reason to think that Matthew and Ebionites had contact with one another. I think those two are independent in their use of Mark. But Luke knew all three of those texts, in my view. Hold on 1 second. All right, I'm back. So there is something I do want to address real quick. I'm not going to get into details. There is some drama going on behind the scenes. I don't want to talk about the details. At least not now. But anyway, I got Dennis McDonald coming on soon in a few days. I think we're scheduled for December 22nd. Yeah, December 22nd. He's going to come on. I titled it Dr. Dennis McDonald Rampages Marcion Priority, Marcion Abridged Luke. That's what it's called. But in any case, I'm going to get off now. I think I honestly said all I had to say for tonight. Really. That's all I had to say. I'm looking forward to finally getting the SPL, getting the History Valley interviews at SPL out. But I'm gonna get them out there. I'm gonna move on from the drama. Move on from the drama going on behind the scenes. It's pathetic. It's done nothing but stress me out the last few days for absolutely no reason. It is absolutely ridiculous what's going on. I'm not taking any guests tonight. And I don't typically randomly invite people in here anymore. The last time I did that, I regretted it. Never again. At least it's not likely I'll ever do that again. So anyway, I'm getting off the stream, guys. Everyone, I'm getting off the stream. I'll see you all later. Good night.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.